Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It is my great honor to introduce our two panelists for tonight. Our first guest is David G. Marwell. David G. Marwell is a historian and author. He served as Chief of Investigative Research at the Department of Justice, where he worked on the investigations and prosecution of Nazi war criminals. David was Executive Director of the JFK Assassination Records Review Board, Director and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in NYC for 15 years. He is on the board of FASPE and is the president of the Leo Baeck Institute, New York, Berlin. His book, Mengele, Unmasking the Angel of Death, was published by W.W. Norton & Co. in 2020. Welcome to the stage, David G. Marwell. And I'd also like to introduce Martine Powers. Martine Powers is the senior host of Post Reports, the Washington Post's flagship daily news podcast. She has worked at the Boston Globe and Politico, and is a graduate of the Transom Story Workshop, and was a Fulbright Fellow in Trinidad and Tobago. Martine is a 2014 FASPE journalism alumni and was named the 2021 Distinguished Fellow at FASPE Annual Ethical Leadership Awards. Please welcome Martine Powers.
Hi, David.
Hey.
So glad to be here.
Me too.
I think it's very clear from the bios why you're here, why you are the expert that we're talking to tonight. But just to explain a little bit more why I'm here, back in 2014, I went on a trip with FASPE, the Fellowship at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics. I'm a journalist. I was with other journalists as well as law school students, and we went to Germany and then Poland, and specifically to Auschwitz, to understand how our professions had failed during the Holocaust and during many historical events since then, and how we could try to do better. And so this is the first time that I'm seeing this play. I know that it's the fourth time that you're seeing it, but it just felt like so much that we saw really, asked those tough questions that FASPE is all about. But the one thing that struck me, and the place I want to start our conversation tonight, is that moment early on in the play when the archivist who has found this album, or is talking to the person who has this album, that she is advocating for it to see the light of day, and that she gets some pushback. And that there is this sense and this belief that I think is pretty justifiable that the discussions around the Holocaust should focus on victims and not on perpetrators. And I think FASPE is all about kind of rethinking that, or thinking about why we should try to understand the perpetrators too. But I wonder for you, what is the purpose of this? What is the purpose of seeing a play like this that is 95% focused on the photo album about the perpetrators rather than the photo album about the victims?
If I could, I will address your question in just one second, but there was an omission in the biography that's very important to partially why I'm here tonight. My bio that was read missed the fact that I was, for several years at the end of the 1990s, the associate director of the Museum of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And what you see behind here, this lab, Judy Cohen, who was a colleague there, I supervised that whole operation until the year 2000, and was part of these kinds of discussions. Rebecca Elbelding, who came right after I left, would have been my colleague. So it's extremely interesting for me to have seen this play, which documents a lot of what we did all the time at the museum. Why is it important to focus on the perpetrators here? And I should say that in the whole historiography of the Holocaust, one really, the importance of the victims as the focus of study really came a bit later in the game. Early on, the focus was on the perpetrators. But with the establishment of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and other museums in the early 1990s, the focus shifted to the victims, importantly so. my training was always to study the perpetrators. And FASPE studies the perpetrators because we think that we can learn a great deal about looking at their activities. We believe that history shouldn't be solely closed between the covers of books or sealed behind the glass in a museum gallery, that there should be some utility from history, and we should make use of it to the extent we can. And we believe by studying the perpetrators, we are able to evaluate, as you did on your trip with FASPE, the issues that might come up in your own career. And if you look at the stunning failure of the professional class during the formation of the Nazi state and the Holocaust, this whole process, there are lessons there for us today, and that's the importance.
But it's such a tricky thing, right? Because I feel like there's this fine line between understanding and lessons learned, and also empathy that is not earned. You know, you see the photo up there of the guy shaking the paw of the dog, and my reaction is like, oh, that's a cute picture. And you know, why is it so alarming that that photo makes us feel that way? And so I wonder, like, what do you think are the ways that we should be engaging with this? What are the questions that we should be asking of these photos and of these perpetrators that aren't about building empathy or making them feel more human, because that's, to me, that goes too far, but are about kind of interrogating that question that you saw characters on the stage struggling with, of like, what would I have done? Would I have been there? Would I have been the woman at the switchboard who was, you know, laughing along with my coworkers on the weekends?
And crying at the lack of blueberries. I would make a distinction between empathy and sympathy. I think empathy is absolutely correct to have in observing these photographs. I think it's what makes us human and what connects us to others. Sympathy is a different matter, where you know the difference, and that's
But
important.
I think it's worth explaining the
Yeah.
difference.
I mean, I think as human beings, when we look at these, we should be able to relate to these perpetrators in a human way. We shouldn't have sympathy for them. We shouldn't feel that. Trying to see what I'm trying to say here. We shouldn't feel bad for them, but we should relate to who they are as human beings. When I worked on the book about Mengele, one of the problems in dealing with Josef Mengele is that he has become, for many, a symbol, that he is larger than life in many ways, and that many people deal with him as if he's some kind of grotesque caricature and not a human being. And my whole point of my book is to try to suggest that this grotesque caricature may be easier for us to deal with because we can distance ourselves from that. But it obscures what is perhaps a bit more unsettling, which is that a human being did that. And we have to learn from that.
I want to talk a little bit more about Mengele now, who wasn't, was pictured in some of these photographs, but wasn't a major focus of this play. But we have seen so much of him in pop culture and sort of our general understanding of the Holocaust, the angel of death, this evil doctor who conducted these horrific experiments. But also there were some misconceptions, inaccurate assumptions or myths around this person. So maybe you could talk a little bit about who he really was and correct some of those myths and kind of give a picture of who he was, how important he was.
Mengele was 32 years old when he got to Auschwitz, the same age as Karl Herker. They were born in the same year.
Which is crazy. I didn't know that until recently, and thinking that this guy was younger than I am.
Mengele grew up in a prosperous family in the town of Günzburg, which is not so far from Stuttgart. The family was quite prominent, quite well off. The town of Günzburg was a company town, and his father owned the company. Had a privileged childhood, But I tried to find, in looking at his life, for some sign of the man that Mengele was later to become, and I found nothing in his childhood that would point to that. No stories of him, torturing house pets in the backyard, or he came from a conservative Catholic family. It was really at the university where he found his direction in life, and became a extremely passionate student of science. Got 2 PhDs at the university, one in anthropology and an advanced degree in medicine. He was on the receiving end of world-class teaching. He had several professors who were Nobel Prize laureates, some who would become Nobel Prize laureates, and was a star, basically. The promise of the new science in Germany, which he was a proponent of. He began to study anthropology and medicine at exactly the time that the Nazis took power. And those two, anthropology and racial science, so-called racial science, became the bedrock for Nazi ideology. That provided the intellectual infrastructure for the Nazi view of the world. And with that elevation of the status of the sciences, Mengele's own status rose, and he became his professor, who was a noted professor, his star pupil, ended up following him to Frankfurt, to the Institute for Racial Hygiene there, and was would have been, had the war not come along, would have been probably well launched on a distinguished career in German science. With the beginning of the war, Mengele was a combat physician assigned to a engineer battalion in one of the Waffen-SS divisions, saw active combat for 18 months on the Eastern Front in areas where we read about every day now in Ukraine, where he was involved in the invasion there. His unit was witness to and closely associated with some mass atrocities early on in the war, but eventually he was evacuated from the area around Stalingrad in 1943 and ended up in Berlin, and finally was assigned to Auschwitz. I know I've given a long biography of him there, but it's important because these components in his life played a role. He gets to Auschwitz in June of 1943 and becomes a camp physician there, which means that he's responsible for, along with the 20 or 30 other camp physicians there, with public health issues within the camp. That is, the suppression of disease and of epidemics. I think one of the characters here was Wirtz. His grandson talked about how he had successfully fought the typhus epidemic.
That he'd helped people, he'd advocated for better conditions, was what he'd been told.
Right, and Mengele was involved in those kinds of activities. Wirtz, by the way, right before Mengele got to Auschwitz, he secured for the physicians the role of the person on the ramp who would sort out the arriving prisoners. That used to be done by other camp personnel. But Wirtz believed that this should be a physician's role because physicians would be better at it. They could better judge who would be able to be exploited for their labor first, or those who should be sent directly to the gas chambers. So it became a kind of also a public health function in the eyes of the Nazis.
But to be clear, I mean, you say a public health function, and I know that a lot of your research is focused on typhoid fever, for example,
yeah.
and how he dealt with the problem of typhoid when it started to spread in our particular bunker. Can you explain a little bit? Barracks, thank you.
Yeah, so one of the Nazi physicians were not so concerned about the health of the prisoners, but the health of the prisoners and the potential for epidemic had a serious impact on the camp staff because people lived in close environments. And so in order to protect the SS personnel at Auschwitz, it was important to, and also in order to protect the workforce that was assisting in forced labor, they had to suppress epidemics. So Mengele had a rather ruthless but effective method for doing this. He would take one barracks in the camp, which was composed of a number of barracks. He would take everyone in the barracks and have them sent to the gas chambers immediately. The barracks would be fumigated and cleaned. The inmates from the next barracks would be taken out. They would be, their clothing would be removed. They'd get new clothing. They would be fumigated and deloused, and they would go into the now clean barracks, and then their barracks in turn would be cleaned. And this would happen then ad seriatim down the line until the entire camp was free of the agents for typhus. And
A testament to his, I guess, commitment to public hygiene.
And my point about public health before was that the actual destruction of the Jews who got there was considered a public health issue because of the threat the Jews had for Aryans. I mean, they posed a direct and specific threat. So in that sense, the use of doctors to carry out these selections on the ramp was considered also part of this whole public health issue. Now, Mengele exploited his time at Auschwitz not only to carry out these medical roles, which also included supervision of executions, certification that the menus that the diet was sufficient, and things like that. On his spare time, he took advantage of the massive humanity that came to Auschwitz to set up, in essence, a kind of research institute there, where he would recruit, I say recruit in quotes, he would force arriving physicians and other medical personnel to work with him in his so-called institute where he was conducting research. So you can imagine Mengele at Auschwitz, while he was there, probably about 750,000 people came through the camp. You can imagine how many of them were physicians, how many were anthropologists, how many were medical draftspeople, how many were nurses, how many were illustrators, things like that. So he was able to recruit very high quality people to assist him in his research at Auschwitz. He was also able to find subjects for his research.
Twins was a thing, right? That he had this obsession with twins, and so even though most children were sent directly to be murdered, that he would choose twins to be part of his
and now
experiments.
It wasn't so much an obsession as the fact that twin research was considered the gold standard for genetic research in Germany. During the Nazi period, 200 dissertations were written based on twin research, which basically looks for, you use identical twins and fraternal twins, and you look for the concordance of pathologies within the twin pairs based on, and if they're identical twins, you can suggest that there's a genetic basis for that, and if they're fraternal twins, you can suggest that there's a environmental basis for that. And this is something that was done all over the world. The Rockefeller Foundation supported research on twins. When the war started, twins who, you need both sets of a twin pair to do the experiments. The kids, especially as the war progressed, were sent to the countryside. The number of twins available for research was drastically reduced. Mengele gets to Auschwitz, and there are, if you think about 1.1 to 1.5 or a little bit more incidence of twins in the general population, just multiply 1.1% against 750,000 people, there are a lot of twins arriving on the trains. And so Mengele is able to, in a sense, rejuvenate the protocol for twin research that had been carried out at the research institutions that he was associated with in Berlin and in Frankfurt.
I want to start taking some questions from the audience in a moment, so think about what you want to ask. But before we get there, I just want to ask, I mean, this is someone who presumably would have taken the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Doctors like him would have done the same thing. And what is your understanding of how they thought about what they did and why they didn't see it as wrong. Like, where did their ethical framework fall apart?
Yeah, they engaged in a kind of moral and ethical sleight of hand in a way. If you look at Nazi ideology, and this is explicitly stated within the medical circles, the focus of care for a Nazi physician was not the individual, but it was rather the racial community. It was the so-called Volksgemeinschaft. This is this German word Volk, which means both race and nation and has a kind of mystical connotation. So if your focus of care is no longer the individual, but a racial community, and you see one group of people as a mortal threat to that community, then you can justify in your own mind attacking that threat. And so this substitution of the focus of care became the basis for this. So Mengele was able, in his own mind, to have been true to his Hippocratic oath.
That it was do no harm to this community,
to this community, to us. And in fact, by not getting rid of the Jews, or by not getting rid of the threat to the racial community, you are doing harm to the community. And so that's a very important kind of important way of looking at the Nazi physician and what allowed him to operate in the way that he did.
I think we hopefully have some questions. We don't have a mic in the audience, so I'm going to point at people and then just try to project, and I'll repeat it back for everyone to hear. I'll start with you, sir, in the green.
I'm trying to speak up. So my wife and myself are both second generation Holocaust survivors, so this is very close to home. And I think this was a terrific play. I hope it will be presented in many places and people will actually, I would put it in any aspect if I could. And I really thank you for that. I would like to, and the general premise here is that, you know, these are not monsters. These are people who made great choices. And this is really something that people need to understand. However, I really want to comment about Mengele, because Mengele was really a monster. So I think that we need, and you made it sound like anybody else in this group of Nazis, he maybe made some great choices. And I don't think you can put him in the same level. Some of them were really monsters. And I really reject what you just said.
I'll repeat it back briefly of drawing this distinction between people who made bad choices versus people who were monsters, which I think many people would describe Mengele as, and yeah.
Yeah, as I said, Mengele has become for many the symbol of the Holocaust itself and the symbol for the escape from justice of so many Nazi criminals. He's taken on, in some ways, the name Mengele got separated from the person Mengele. And if we look at what we know about Mengele, there are countless stories of people who had encounters with Mengele when Mengele was never at Auschwitz, or people who said that he spoke Hungarian when he didn't speak Hungarian. There's a kind of what some historians have called the Mengele effect, where people have displaced onto Mengele the deeds not only of Mengele himself, but of all the other physicians. He became a symbol for an entire group of individuals. And what I'm trying to suggest in my book is that we have to separate out who Mengele was and who this caricature of this person that was created in part by popular culture, by plays, by novels. Certainly for what Mengele did and what was involved in was monstrous, but he was a man.
I'm curious, I should say, I know David, I also know Becky Belding because I've been a docent at the museum, but I'm curious, David, when you heard, that Becky got the album in 2007, I believe, and I'm wondering, when did you
Yeah, I think the statute of
Let me just
limitations.
add- so the question is, what was it like essentially when you first encountered these photos, and did you have a chance to look through them and what you thought when you saw Mengele?
A colleague of mine from the museum, and I'm saying the statute of limitations, I think, is probably run on this, so I won't get her in trouble. But she came up to New York when I was at the Museum of Jewish Heritage there, and she brought me a Xerox of the album sometime probably in 2010, 2011, something like that. So I was able to see it, and at that time I had no idea that I'd be writing a book about Mengele, but I had worked on the Mengele case, and I was riveted by the photographs of him, which were, of course, were what riveted Becky at the beginning as well because of her interest.
Right over there.
I'm curious about, you referred to all the people getting off the trains, and presumably there were a lot of doctors who were getting off the train.
Yes.
I was in London in the early 60s for the libel case involved that turned into Leon Uris's book QB7, and I heard some of the doctors testify, and I was wondering what your research shows. Not every doctor went along. There were doctors who were in the prisoner doctors who were willing to take the risk of being killed rather than participating.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether the FASPE did that, or what your research has shown on that.
So this audience member is asking about doctors who were objectors, who did not want to participate and took risks to do that.
Yeah, so are you talking specifically about inmate physicians who? Yeah. So inmate physicians were placed in a kind of situation of what one historian has called a choiceless choice. You're recruited to assist in medical experiments. The alternative is not a happy one. But of course, some people did, and there are people there are good scholars now who are working on this whole issue of inmate physicians. And there's some good stuff that's been written about it. Not everyone went along. Some simply could not participate in these experiments. And some of the experiments, some of the work that the physicians did was when we look at research, the so-called experiments at Auschwitz and other camps, you can really divide it into a couple of different categories. One, I would say, was a kind of practical research in also a kind of grotesque way. The German Air Force had a problem with when they developed the jet aircraft and the high altitude and the impact in an unpressurized cabin on pilots. So they wanted to experiment with what was the impact of high altitude, low pressure on pilots. So they set up an air pressure chamber at Dachau and subjected inmates, unwilling inmates, to a terrible set of experiments, which ended often in death, but certainly resulted in significant pain. The same thing with how do you rewarm a pilot who has to ditch his plane in the North Atlantic and is suffering from hypothermia. What's the most effective way to rewarm them? So they would put people in ice baths and then figure out how they could be rewarmed. So-called practical, the potability of seawater. How do you make seawater potable, and so that flyers or people who are in the water can make it drinkable. There were a series of experiments that were linked specifically to genocide. The effective mass sterilization techniques. Part of genocide, if you sterilize everyone and they can't reproduce, that is part of the definition of genocide. And at Auschwitz, they had a large series of experiments on the most effective way for sterilization. There were another set of experiments, even experiments, by the way, on electroconvulsive therapy, because the Nazis felt that this might be a way of getting inmates to be more effective in their labor. And they set up an ECT machine and did a bunch of experiments on that. There were other scientists or so-called scientists who were involved in this, where I put Mengele, in what one might call science. The experiments that were done to advance knowledge in whatever context that you want to consider it, to advance science, the science that they were practicing, and also to advance their careers and their reputation. It's clear that Mengele at Auschwitz was really attempting to do research that would allow him to write his Habilitationsschrift, his postdoctoral dissertation, which would give him the credentials to be a professor or head of an institute later on in Germany. So that's kind of the taxonomy of research, very briefly stated.
Right there?
A lot of the play was about ordinary Germans eventually coming to do what we now consider evil things as a society, as individuals. When you stand back from all this, especially with your DOJ background, and you relate it to our current conditions, the current political discourse in the country, and if you had grandchildren and they said, what can we learn from this? What were the two things that you would tell them about this play and our discourse and warning signs that we need to be aware of?
That's a great question. I'll just repeat it back for people who didn't hear. What are the lessons that we can learn from this play, essentially? You know, when we look at ordinary people who did horrific things and think about our current moment and our current political moment. I'll let you take that as you want.
Yeah.
You know, what do we tell our grandchildren about what we should learn from this?
Well, I think that's in some ways the basis for why we founded FASPE in the first place. And you could chime in on this answer as well, because it has to do with what do you learn from this? This is what you're asking, right? I mean, if you're asking about can you draw parallels to our current political situation and to the Nazi period, that's a different question, I think. In which case, I would say the big lie is the kind of common denominator. But in terms of what can we learn from how individuals acted? You know, a lot of people, and this is why it's important not to think of these people as monsters, but to think of them as people and who had careers. At FASPE, we talk about mundane motives that can lead to unthinkable actions. The desire to build your career, to impress your boss, to advance in the ways that we all want to advance.
Or even aversion to conflict, right? That,
or
like,
aversion to conflict.
The people I work with are my friends, and it makes me uncomfortable to say something when they do something that I think is wrong.
Yeah, and at FASPE we try also not only to sensitize people, and FASPE is not just a historic history training program. It's partially that. It's really a program about contemporary ethics, the ethical issues and challenges that professionals will meet in their careers. And we not only try to have meaningful discussions about this. In medicine, we talk about end-of-life issues. We talk about rationing. We talk about those kinds of issues. In journalism, we talk about foreign correspondence. What do you do when you're assigned to Moscow now? How do you do your job in
Relationships with sources and how much you kind of push back, knowing that you might get kicked out of a country or eliminate your opportunity for future scoops and news telling.
And we also I think the talk back last night was about should I stay or should I go? If you're part of a regime or part of a government operation, and you know that if you leave, someone else is going to come in who could be much worse than you. Do you stay or do you go? Those kinds of conflicts. We also try to give people strategies for how to deal. We think that most people have a good sense, either from mother's milk, from breakfast table discussions, from church or synagogue, of what's right and wrong, but often they don't know how to implement it. They don't know how to find the technique to kind of exercise their moral muscles and speak out. So those kinds of things.
I think we have time for one more question. I'll take it.
One thing that was interesting was you were talking about different jobs that people have, and they sort of went from one job to another, and then you also had some of the people who jumped right into a job. The message people who got to kill this on your people right away. Is there a difference that you see in the moral dilemma of how people process it, if they kind of slowly, slippery slope get there, or if they're just thrown in?
The question is, do the different people's career trajectories influence, how they're able to process the work that they're doing?
I think it's very important to think about the Holocaust and almost every single historical event as not as an event, but as a process. That if you told someone in 1933, when Hitler came to power, in a few years you're going to be helping to murder hundreds of thousands, millions of people, they would never believe you. It just couldn't possibly happen. But human beings accommodate themselves in steps. Slippery slope would be one metaphor, but it's probably slower than that in a sense. When you really change the kind of normative values of a society, which is what happened in Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, before the Nazis came to power, there was a strong and vibrant and effective left wing in Germany, which the Nazis did their best at the beginning to destroy, but it disappeared. Many people were imprisoned and all, but the whole normative structure of what was right and wrong changed in a long, gradual process. Not that long, but gradual process.
I actually want to ask one more question that I realize is the question that this gentleman over here asked that we didn't actually answer, and I think it's really important to answer because we were talking about essentially like diagnosing all the ways or the moral dilemmas that people face in their jobs, back in the 1940s and now. But like, what are we supposed to do, right? When we're facing those challenging decisions, how do we know how to act? And like, what is your advice, if you had one piece of advice for people walking out of here, for how you do act in the spirit of moral courage in situations that are hard?
Well, I always think, when we first started FASPE, we thought of, FASPE's not a great name, but we thought we'd have this character we'd call FASPE who would sit on people's shoulder and would whisper in their ear. And we have a kind of FASPE character inside ourselves. Trained from early age and strengthened by what we read and what we see and by people whom we admire. And I would say we have to listen to that voice within us. Not everyone has it, but those who have it need to listen to it. And FASPE tries to make that voice more articulate and more insistent. And we have to find the right strategies to act. I mean, and every situation is different, but I firmly believe, and I'm hoping that my children and grandchildren have that voice well trained, and also understand their responsibility to listen acutely to it.
That's good advice. David, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for being here. Appreciate it. Have a good night.